Without further ado, I have Chapter 7. The party moved to one of the suite's interior rooms to discuss matters more privately. Even then, they discussed the situation in low tones. There was no certainty that spies were not listening from hidden places above the ceilings. It's Hamalticas of Lacvosta all over again, declared University. More politely done, no locked doors, but the same. Gwathnaran was frowning. I'm afraid you're right, lady. We'll have to think about what we do here. It will be difficult to escape, and impossible to do so without the king's men following and harassing us all the way. You have any thoughts in the matter? Not yet, lady, but I will consider it. Quedram, after listening to this exchange, went to the doorway as he began taking stones out from around the door jamb and stacking them carefully beside him. Stop! What are you up to now? He turned to look at Gwathnaran. I'm pulling stones out of the wall, and when I get done, I'll go do the same at the corridor wall. And at that time, it'd be good if you were to put on your most lordly face and demand the guards escort you to the king because our rooms are falling apart. And what good is that going to do? Quedram was working it out for himself as he went along. They'll know there was nothing wrong with these rooms, and they'll know nobody could do this sort of thing without tools. They'll ask the king, maybe even take us to see him again. And if the stones keep coming out of the walls, he might decide it would be best to let us go, or do away with us altogether. And if it looks like that's happening, I'll make stones fly. How many guards do you think I'll have to knock down with flying stones to make the rest unwilling to touch us? Not to mention how the king will feel if his place continues to fall apart. Casabanyo spoke up then. It's an idea, though. I might be willing to suggest that something dislikes our party being held here. How long can you keep on manipulating stones? That was the Lady Anna's story, concern in her voice. Long enough, lady. I'm just moving one stone at a time, not a whole city wall. He was beginning to work out a technique, which stones he could pull out without the whole lot coming down. There were times, of course, when several came loose, but he was always willing to catch them and lower them to the floor. When he had a hole large enough to step through, he went to the outer chamber and began to remove stones from the wall there. In this case, however, he did not go on for very long before the door flew open. What's happening in here? The stones continued to fall from the wall, drifting down to stack themselves on the floor. Quedram, while dismantling the walls, held himself ready. Everything depended on the guards' reaction. They might, just possibly, try to use their weapons, and if they did, he had to be prepared to act. Gwathnaran stepped forward. I'm sure the king did not intend to insult the Lady University by assigning her to dilapidated quarters, where the stones fall from the walls as we speak. One guard looked at the other. The senior man spoke. Latvian, go fetch the captain. Tell him it's an emergency. He then spoke to Gwathnaran as the other guard's footsteps went hurrying down the hall. Lord, I have no authority to alter or change your quarters. If you will be patient, I am sure matters can be worked out to your satisfaction. His voice was steady, though his eyes wandered now again to where the stones were drifting down from the wall, seating themselves with a light click. The captain was not long in coming, a squat and burly man, his helmet slung sad at his belt, his broad face without expression, until he saw the stones coming down. He stiffened. Dark Destroyer's teeth! Then he mastered himself. What's going on here? Casabanyo chose that moment to speak. I believe, Captain, that there is some power at work which causes the very stones to protest at keeping the lady here. You're doing this, wizard? I've heard about your sort. We can deal with you. I can promise you, Captain, by the vows I have taken, that the power that moves the stones has nothing to do with me. The captain looked at him a moment longer, then nodded sharply. So, he turned to his men. His eye fell on Lotafun. You, Lotafun, go tell the chief servant what we've got here. We might want to roast out a magician. Sir! With the barest flicker of annoyance at being sent off running again, Lodophon was away. The captain, much less steadfast than the other senior guard, said to Guathnarin, "Lord, we'll have to have the chief servant out to see to different quarters for you. I don't have the authority." Destroyer's teeth! His eyes kept drifting to the steadily stacking stones. Captain continued to wait, by turns clutching his sword pommel and wiping his palms on his trousers. At last the chief servant came up, in his tow a tall man, a tall man by Gaffrati standards, who wore a loose jacket and gray leggings, along with a round little hat. He also had a lean and an aesthetic look, and a beak of a nose. He looked at the situation, made a hand gesture which ended up snapping with a snapping of fingers, and a blue light surrounded Casabano. A moment later, the light turned brilliant green. The wizard nodded. He is doing some things, small working, such as a magician has in operation most times, but he has nothing to do with the walls. Quedram had already decided he would simply standing with the rest, not doing anything to call attention to himself. He was waiting for the magician to do the next step, to try to discover just where the power came from that was moving the stones. When he did that, Quedram would have to think of some way to deal with him. The fellow had evidently already decided to check the only wizard in the group, however. A reasonable decision, but one indicating a nature that was not sufficiently suspicious. The chief servant, a well-fed man with a harnessed air, said, "Then you believe the story of theirs, that some power the stones to object to the presence of the lady? The magician made another gesture, similar but slightly different to the first, and the blue light surrounded the lady. A moment later, it changed to pink, then faded again. She is undoubtedly the cause of it, though there's something unusual in her relationship, shall we call it? The action being undertaken. But yes, I'd say the underlying cause is rooted in her presence." Again, Quedram noted. The fellow was not asking the right questions. It was true, though, that the Lady Anavista's presence was the cause of the removal of the stones. The chief servant frowned, as though all this were some part of great design to make his life difficult. "Well, this must go to the king." "Lady, lords, I ask that you be patient a little longer. The king must make a decision." "Of course," the lady answered. So they waited, and the stones continued to move out of the walls and stack themselves. The guards tried not to stare at the sight, but their gaze continued to drift in that direction. Quedram was a little worried over how many stones he could pull out of the walls before the roof fell in. He varied his choice of walls and positions of stones within the walls as much as he was able, but unless something interrupted him, there would come a time when the chambers were unsafe. Luckily, the chief servant came back in a short time. He bowed to the lady, looking more harassed than ever, and said, "The king wishes to speak with you. If you will be so good as to follow me?" "Certainly." So once again they went trooping along the hallways with guards, a larger number this time, to the right and the left. Quedram, improvising as he went along, brought with him 2 ranks of stones from the walls, floating at head height, between the party and the guards. The guards held their discipline in face of this, though it was clearly a near thing. The captain stomped along, muttering quietly, "Destroyer's teeth! Dark Destroyer's teeth! Bloody Dark Destroyer's teeth!" as though it was a litany to ward off evil. The king continued to smile and be welcoming, though his smile grew strained at the sight of the stones floating along, as if an escort. "What's this, lady?" he demanded brusquely, ignoring the usual courtesies and belying his smile. The lady bowed, taking her cue from Casabano's hint, said, "It appears, Highness, that the stones of your palace wish to be rid of us." She made her statement short, with no demands that they be set free at once. The king gazed at the sight, the gathered visitors, the servants, the guards, the floating stones. What sort of trick is this? A trick, Highness? Did not your magician explain to you? Magicians? Bah! Something is going on here, lady. Something I do not care for. Not at all, lady. Quadrum thought it time to push matters just a little. There was a grating sound, and a stone in the wall of the great hall pulled itself free and joined the others in their lines. The king lost his smile then. "Kill them all!" he shouted, face pale with anger and fear. The guards turned to do their duty, but Quadrum had not lost his awareness of the armed men all around. The stones moved, ringing on helmets, thudding on flesh, and a moment later there wasn't a guard standing. The king was standing, though, standing and staring. The lady spoke again, and Quadrum admired not only her coolness, but her quick thinking. "I believe they want us gone, not dead, Highness." The king's smile was gone, and its place was a snarl. Was a snarl. "So if that's to be the way of it, let it be so. Go, all of you, back to your hills, and don't think to have heard the last of this. Chief servant, see them gone." They went as quickly and as carefully as they could. Quadrum wondered if the others were thinking, like him, of whether the king might change his mind and have them ambushed on the way out of the city. Just have to hope he stays a little unsure of the situation for long enough. Might that power tear down his great hall around him? If he goes against it? Quadrum kept his escort of stones until they were well out of the city. Then, rather than merely discarding them, he set them in a low two-course wall across the road. Gwatharen gave him a look as the stones rattled into their places. Just another hint for the king. Later that evening, with an extra blanket wrapped around him, he drank a cup of soup and shivered. The whole thing had been tiring, very tiring. Only the fact that he'd been practicing daily and getting more and more used to his ability had kept him from collapse. Casabanos sat beside him. "Quite the effort, young Quadrum. I might have made a change or two if I'd had been in charge, but it did have its effect." "We were lucky," Quadrum mumbled. "That magician should have been able to spot me." Casabanos shook his head. "Not luck, or at least not altogether luck. This power of yours, whatever it is, does not seem to relate to the most forms of magic. He was looking for ordinary forms of magic, of course, did not find them." "It is possible," the Third Wizard went on, "that if he'd asked the right question, is someone here causing this, he might have gotten an answer involving you. But, as it was, he asked if I were doing it, I was not. Then he asked if the lady were doing it, and she was not. At that point, he decided I was probably correct. As I said, luck, but not luck only." A shadow fell over them, and Quadrum looked up to see the lady standing over them. "Casabanos, I would like a word with Quadrum." Okay, just give me a minute here. "Of course, lady." She settled gracefully into the place he'd left. "Thank you once more, Quadrum. I'm afraid this journey was a failure. We've turned the king from a friendly neutral to an enemy." She waved down his beginning protest with a slim hand. "No, I don't fault you. He would have held us until Higfrid was totally under Atlas's power, and we would have ended our days as landless hangers-on at his court. What you've done is to set us free from that, and he probably won't bother us, expecting Atlas to finish us in the spring. But we're free again, and while we're free, we have some hope. And you shall be rewarded." Her gentle voice was relaxing him. He was barely able to mutter, "No reward necessary." She looked at him again. "I'm sorry. You're worn to a stump, and here I am nattering at you. Sleep well, true friend." She kissed him lightly on the cheek and was gone. No matter how much he would have preferred to stay awake and enjoy that moment, his eyes insisted on falling shut. The return journey in winter weather to the wooded Badaba could not really be called uneventful, but at least they lost no more men nor horses. There were nightly discussions to which the Lady University expressly required Quadrum's attendance, where future plans were discussed. The first such meeting began with Lord Gwathnerin declaring, "The situation is against us, and will be so long as Batless has the initiative. If we continue to lurk in the hills, he can ignore us until our support is faded to nothing, then hunt us down." "Do you have any thoughts as to how we can take the initiative?" the lady asked. "It will have to be an attack into the lowlands. Not only that, it will have to be a credible attack. At present, we haven't the force for that. And we have sent most of our army home. Do you think they'll come back?" "Perhaps a handful, a little more, until we have shown that there's something to come back to. But you will recall it was necessary to send the army away. We couldn't have kept them dead in the wood Badaba for the winter." "This means that we'll deal with what we have, not what we wish we had. Quedram, would you have your strength pull down Latvosta's walls again?" "I might, but much depends on what they've got in there. If I make a breach and they jam those pottery men into it, where are we?" Gwathnerin frowned. "There's a question. Will Batless have sent for the pottery soldiers to return to him, or will he leave them with Lossabalson in Latvosta for so long as we're free, and a possible threat?" "I'd suggest we count on them being in the town until we have credible evidence to the contrary." "Which leaves us with the question, what shall we do? We don't have the numbers to storm it. Even if we get a fair number of men coming back to us in the spring, the casualties we take in storming Latvosta would make further recruiting difficult." So the discussion went on, evening after evening. One topic was how many troops were likely to rally them. Another, possible ruses to take Latvosta. Most such ruses were too complex to work. How many engines, rams, catapults, and towers would be needed to take the town? What effect would all this have on getting troops to fight Batless in the open field? Even by the time they reached the wooded Badaba, there was no real consensus on most topics, as far as Quedram could see. The main positive thing that emerged was that Gwathnerin was now accustomed to considering him as a useful member of the group, though perhaps not a friend. "Aha! He's returned from the big city," cried Genialabis as Quedram entered the shelter. "And what news? Is the king going to lend us troops?" "Not for me to say," Quedram answered. "The lady will make her announcement when the time is right. Folk like me oughtn't to be spreading tales and rumors." "But you were there!" protested Malsanto. "You know as much as any, and it wouldn't be spreading tales. You'd be telling the truth." "She'll tell it all in her own time. Not for me to be messing around with the news." When the rumor mill had received the tale, they were doubly annoyed with him, as friends might be. "No, I can't say anything about it," he says, and all the time he's the one who managed to get them out whole. Not one little word. Not even, "I had to do some tricks with rocks." No, not Quedram. He keeps his good friends in the dark. "You'd prefer me to be a blowhard like you, Malsanto?" "We'd think you could tell your friend a little bit, Quedram. It's not as though we'd go babbling through the camp." "Someone did, Malsanto, and I doubt the lady will be happy to know that everything went on, down to the color of the king's shoes, is running around the camp already." "If the lady is surprised at it, she's incredibly naive." "Did she strike you as incredibly naive?" Quedram smiled at that. "No, I just didn't want it to be my fault." Malsanto looked at Genialabis. "You hear that, Jenny? No wonder the lady plans on making him a lord. Probably take precedence over us too, and have us bowing every time we see him." "Oh yes, Lord Quedram of the big stones, and won't he lord it over his former companions?" "Old woman's apron, you're insane, the both of you. Nobody's going to make a lord out of me." "Listen to him, Malsa. You'd think he, of all people, would have a little notion of what's really in the wind." With this sort of warning, unofficial and flippant as it might be, Quedrin was not totally surprised when Lady Anaversti asked him to come take a place next to Gwathmeurin, and thus nearer to her. She stood and spoke to the group. By now everyone has heard what Quedrin has done in my service. I think it is time, and past time, that I declare him to be a close friend of the Carmista. Still smiling, she looked round at the assembly. Now, there are certainly some here for whom a certain seat at a table is of great importance. Let me assure you, because Quedrin is sitting nearer to me, you have not fallen in my esteem. Rather, he is risen. She sat, and Quedrin heard Gwathmeurin mutter, "Won't work, Anaki. You rubbed some noises out there in a bad smell." She smiled at him and answered in a low voice, "I did something that had to be done. I'm sorry if it's made your job harder." Quedrin could feel animosity, mostly towards him, but there was some towards the lady herself. Yes, Gwathmeurin would have a harder time looking out for the lady's welfare. Perhaps he, Quedrin, should do some watching out as well. Yes, he could look after himself, but she shouldn't suffer on his account. He set certain faces in his mind, certain people whose attitudes he was fairly sure of, who might just do something wrong. The meeting was the usual statement of strategies, then of resources, both actual and potential. There is a lot of talk regarding stratagems to take Lakvosta without the necessity of storming it. The bare fact is, Gwathmeurin told the assembly, we have to do something specific and telling deed to prove we're still a force to be reckoned with, a beacon to call men back to our force who might otherwise loathe to come forward. Taking Lakvosta will be such. It's far enough from the center of things to allow us time after taking it to send out our summons. Far enough that Batlas can't have any army marching on us before we get any good of taking the town. Some made suggestions of sending men disguised in various sending in men disguised as various shepherds or merchants, who would kill the guards in the middle of the night, then open the gates and let the main army in. Some made suggestions of sending in men disguised variously as shepherds or merchants, some made more complex suggestions, so much more complex as to render them impossible to carry out without some of the complexities causing the plan to fall apart. One man, a broad-shouldered fellow, whose beak of a nose looked as though it had been the model for that horrible coin, said, "Could not Quedrin use his stone magic to pick men off the walls and allow us to go up and over them safely with ladders?" Everyone looked at Quedrin for an answer. "The honest truth is that I don't know. It is possible, perhaps, but I'd have to do considerable practice. I doubt if I could clear a whole wall and keep it cleared. I suspect the men going up the ladders would still catch some arrow fire, though it might be less than usual." Quedrin noted the fellow who had brought the matter up was one he'd already marked as likely to make trouble. "I see," said the fellow, with a definite hint in his voice that Quedrin did not seem to be as great as he had been portrayed. Quedrin himself did not bother to respond, knowing how useless it would be. He also noticed that Gwathmeurin had his hand on the Carmista's arm under the table, restraining her from coming to her feet to defend him. As he did so, Gwathmeurin said, "Solba Denser, Quedrin's abilities are new to us all, and not thoroughly tested. To be sure that there was some slight stress on the pronoun, will be working through the winter to discover how best to serve the lady." "Not the best method altogether, Gwathmeurin. You've asked him whether he's going to do anything useful, and if all he can do is swing a sword, he might just feel a little more testy." Winter wore on. They held general meetings whose main purpose was to pass on news from people who had gone down to spy on the situation in the town. A man going down with a pack of hides to sell might, if he kept his eyes and ears open, learn a lot. If you were careful not to ask suspicious questions or try to look at things a trapper ought not to look at, he might find out a good deal. If you were careful who he approached, he might set up the beginnings of a spy system in the town. People who already knew a good deal, and who knew others who knew and who could find out information. Information that could be passed along to the next man who came along to give the proper password. All this meant there was a stream of intelligence coming out in bits and pieces to the ladies' camp. Such reports were not always a reason for calling a meeting, but as the winter wore on, sometimes a bit of news that might have been considered small was used as a reason to recall them to the purpose of their existence in the wilds. With winter's cold and damp came other visitors, diseases which ran through the camp like fire. Casabano proved to have an extensive knowledge of herbal remedies, including herbs found practically nowhere else but in the hills. He was kept busy, tramping from sickbed to sickbed, mixing up doses and overseeing the unwell. Neither Quedrim nor his two companions fell ill, but Melsanto declared, without that wizard, I swear we'd have lost a third of our number. I've seen illness and despondency take people off before. You, Melsa? You make it sound as if you've been in hill camps with a lady in desperate straits dozens of times before. No. It was 3 years back. My father and some of our men got caught on the wrong side of the Dishbalin River chasing outlaws. We had to camp there until the river went down far enough for us to get back, and that meant most of the winter. About half of us made it. Quedrim often went out with the hunters. It became a known fact that if Quedrim could see something, he could kill it with a sling stone. It was seldom he came back from a hunting trip without something, even if it be only a few quail or rabbits. Also, with the advance to Lochbos coming up, he continued to practice with stones, strengthening his abilities and thinking about how one man, using stones of whatever size, might carry out a town's conquest. He thought on occasion that it might just be a little easier if he could go down and convince Losabalson to bet his town against Quedrim's ability to do something with a stone or two. By spring, they had a fair notion how many soldiers were in Lochbosta, within a margin of error of 25 to 100. There was no consensus on the numbers of pottery men, which Quedrim felt was an important omission. One story said the pottery soldiers had been returned to Butless in the city of Higbrud, but another said, since they needed neither eat nor drink, and since their inability to do other than follow literal orders unsuited them to garrison duties, they'd been stored away in a store and warehouse. One enterprising fellow even claimed to have seen them, stacked floor to ceiling like cordwood. Gwathnaran stated to a meeting, "We'll proceed as if they were in the town and available for immediate use. Not an endearing prospect, but one I feel we must accept." That statement eased Quedrim's mind. They weren't going rushing in and hoping for the best. Solbadancer asked, "What of our third wizard? Can he tell us whether they're present or not?" Hasabano himself answered, "There's been a spell put over the town to prevent such spying. I have made some strong efforts to penetrate that spell, and have gathered no more than vague notions. There is something inimical there. Whether it is petty soldiers or something else, I can't say." Solbadancer scowled. We are going near blind into a dangerous enterprise, and our wizard seems unable to breach magical protections or to defend us against magical warriors. Gwathnaran turned a fierce look on him. "Are you defeated before you start, then, Solbadancer? Perhaps you best turn your command over to another." Solbadancer straightened. "Turn my command over to someone else? Not likely in this world. Then perhaps you'd better come up with some positive plans rather than merely moaning over all the difficulties we face." Next day, Casablanio found Quedrim, who was whirling some stones in a circle in front of himself, swooping them down near his feet and bringing them back up above his head. I take it as kindness if you set those stones down for a moment, so I can talk to you without fear of being brained. Quadrum landed the stones and smiled. Will you say anything that might make me want to brain you? I hope not. It's only that I understand you to have some ability with making talismans. Quadrum scowled at this reminder of his past. A few of the easier ones, yes. That's all that's really necessary. That's really all that's necessary. You see, given the state of our forces and the forces against us, I'd like something to hearten our men. I see. So, what do you want from me? I'd like to build some talismans, some rather powerful ones, and you could help. No, I don't expect you to build them yourself, but if I give you instructions, I believe you could make some simple talismans that I could embed in other talismans to produce something of a different order. Quadrum frowned. I learned about such things, but old Furlock was vague on the theory. He could do more than I, but not much. Are you willing to learn this? If it'll help, I'll do it. He learned a good deal in the next few days. He'd never known before that if you take a talisman of water purification, then altered it just so, it was no more than a collection of bits and pieces of material. If one took that as a starting point, though, one could make something more powerful with it. He also discovered, though Frail Luck had mentioned it a time or two, that with the more powerful talismans there were limits on how many one could make. These limits had little to do with the availability of materials. For some of the most powerful, a person could only make one per year. Even making several different talismans, if they were of the same order, was not possible. I'm not going to teach you all about the orders of talismans and their relationships and limitations, young Quadrum. Just enough to get by here. Is that the way you were taught to make a talisman of water purification? Pretty much, yes. Quadrum scowled, trying to recall just how old Brellick had taught him before Quadrum had taken to cutting corners. And it would work, too, for a while. Now, go back at it from this point here. A rough finger pointed at a place on the talisman, and follow my directions. It only made Quadrum feel worse when he himself recalled, as soon as Casabano pointed out the first error, the way things ought to have gone. His annoyance with himself came out in snappishness at Casabano, who only smiled gently at Quadrum's snarls. A few days later, Casabano called a meeting. It was a fairly short meeting. Casabano got up and announced, I have, with some assistance, produced 2 talismans. One is a talisman of hiding, which can shelter up to 100 men. It is not invisibility, more a matter of strongly suggesting people look elsewhere, and of convincing them that there is no movement there. And so on. The moment a person under that protection touches a person not under it, the effect of the talisman is lost for all. The talisman cannot be made to operate for another 10 days, and once it is used, it cannot be used again for 6 weeks. The second talisman I have here is one of wound healing. This one can heal any cut or gash, though it cannot reattach severed limbs. It has other limitations, such as being able to do no more than 1,144 healings, great or small, before it must be put aside. It can recover, of course. For instance, if it's used up completely one day, it may be used once, perhaps twice, the next day, twice, perhaps 4 times if it's left 2 days, and perhaps up to 5 times if it's left for a 3rd day. However, using it up too often can remove the magic altogether. He paused and looked around. Even with these limitations, these talismans should be useful. Guathnarin looked up. Very useful indeed. Their mere presence will be an encouragement to our army. There is one thing further. We move on Lakvosta in a week's time. Make ready. Lakvosta loomed above them as they crept around to the front gate. Somewhere back behind them, the main body was coming. But the advance party, if Quedrum was a fair sample, did not brood on the paucity of their own numbers. They consisted mostly of light infantry with a score of archers. Quedrum had been interested to find his own old acquaintance, Saldo, among the light infantry, though they hadn't a chance to do more than exchange a greeting, what with the forced march and all. The talisman of hiding sheltered them, and every one of them had hoped the thing would work as they had been told it would. A fair number likely had their doubts. Now the advance party were facing the gate. It was locked and barred as usual. If the town had been under siege, the garrison commander would also have put a barricade in the space behind the gate. Gwathmeren glanced at Quedrum. Your plan. You start off. Quedrum took a deep breath. It was his plan, though Gwathmeren had done a good deal of ebendation and smoothing out. In the starlight, it was difficult to see much, but Quedrum could make out the stones here and there on the ground. He hauled one up about the size of his torso and hurled it against the gate. Hardly waiting to see what damage he might have done, he hurled another, and another. At that time, it became difficult to make out stones of the appropriate size, so he took two he had already used and brought them up to smash against the gate with all the strength he could manage. The gate began to give. Massive though it was, the continual battering was more than it could endure. The alarm inside had gone up an age ago, it seemed. There was shouting and the sound of trumpets. The men on the walls cast down their torches to be able to see who was outside, and there were more shouts of alarm when those on the wall could see no people. There was nothing but two boulders moving back and rushing forward to smash at the gate. As he continued to move the stones, Quedrum realized he ought to have thought of that. The sight of two stones with no human agency battering at the gate would surely also batter at the defenders' morale. Gwathmeren had certainly thought of that. Then the gate smashed in. With a shout, the small party rushed forward. Their sudden appearance, seemingly out of nowhere, caused more dismay on the walls. Quedrum took stones from his pouch and slung them at wherever he could see in the light of the torches still on the walls. Whatever hindrance he could do to be establishing order up there would be all the good. The garrison commander managed to get some troops formed inside the gate, and there was a roaring battle going on almost at once. Quedrum left off slinging stones at the men on the walls and moved in under the arch. He then went to work with the same two stones he used on the gate, but this time he was battering the enemy ranks. With the assistance to the previous invisible troops, the enemy were soon dead or fled. Arrows were coming down from the walls now, and Quedrum took one of his special stones, and whenever he saw any sign of movement, he let fly. Nor was he the only one fighting back. The Gafrati archers were also shooting, though the light was not good. Then the Gafrati archers went swarming up the walls to take hold of the section over the gate. The advance party had as their objective first to open the gates, and second to hold the gates until the main body arrived. To that end, they held their position just a little way inside the gate, so no one could come in behind them without taking a circuitous route from one of the other town gates. After having driven off the first enemy force, it seemed the Gafrati were given 5 heartbeats respite before another force of Dori came shouting round a corner and charged down the street at them. Quedrum sent the 2 large stones to plow through their ranks and then brought them back again. The Dori broke and ran before they even came close to quarters with the invaders. Quedrum leaned against a wall, breathing deeply. "Are you hurt?" Gwathmeren was looking at him with concern. "Just a bit tired. Heaving those things around on top of a night march is a bit much for me." "Rest while you can. They'll be back." Quedrum wanted to ask how much longer before the main body could be expected, but he wasn't going to ask Gwathmeren. That would only earn him a look of scorn. He looked around. Was the sky lightning, or was that his imagination? If it weren't his imagination, then where was the rest of the army? He'd known this was a dangerous enterprise, But he didn't want this to be he didn't want it to be a futile one as well. Him and this little band wiped out, and the gates swung to, and blocked against the rest of the Carmista's army. What have you got yourself into? Quadrim wondered to himself. Here they come! Here they came indeed. This time it was the pottery soldiers, 3 abreast, spears presented. Given what he'd seen of them in action, Quadrim knew a mere 100 men, less than that, now couldn't possibly hold them. It was too late to do anything but try. It wasn't as if they hadn't been warned. Casabanho had told them, it's likely the pottery soldiers are stored, and it will take a little time to reactivate them. But there is a chance that little time would be less than we like, and we can't eliminate every risk. Quadrim didn't waste time fretting. He could still throw stones, maybe slow them down a bit, at least. Even as he flung the first rock down at chest height, he realized there was a better method. If he sent the stones at ankle height, he could cause more confusion, if it were possible for pottery soldiers to be confused. In fact, it worked better than he could have expected. The first ranks went down with a clatter, and the others fell over them before they were aware of the situation. Once down, they seemed unable to arise again quickly. Not a terrible disadvantage for invulnerable warriors. It did give the advance party that little extra time. Further, many of the pottery soldiers had broken legs and were unable to rise at all. They were just beginning to organize themselves once more when Quadrim brought the stones hurling back. Once more, pottery men were upended, some with legs broken, some smashed entirely. They managed to rise and come on again, though once more the stones came plunging back, and by this time the pottery men were at close quarters with the Gafrati. Quadrim hesitated. Then he sent the stones up and brought them smashing down from above. What had Casabanho said? Something about any one of the pottery men being able to endure only so many blows without smashing, with no way of discovering how many, save to continue to strike. Well, if he dealt as many blows and as hard as possible, could he use up their invulnerability? So the stones went up and down, and again, and with each blow it seemed one pottery man broke. Did sending one stumbling into another count as a blow? Have to ask Casabanho. Have to survive to ask Casabanho. He'd been heaving stones, and heavy stones, for a long while. A very long while. And he was beginning to feel it. How much longer could he manage to go on? Then, shouting broke out from behind. Quadrim's first thought was that of the garrison. Lacbosta had managed to take them from the rear. Then the pikes went slipping past them, striking toward the pottery men, driving through the desperate remains of the advance force. The phalanx had arrived. It was still too soon for Quadrim to be able to rest, though. There were still enough pottery men to hold the phalanx, and perhaps hold it long enough for the garrison commander to bring up reinforcements. It seemed an awfully long time before the last pottery soldiers were withdrawn. The commander, Quadrim thought hazily, had probably decided there were better uses for the pottery soldiers being smashed to powder, bit by bit, defending a street. The phalanx surged on down the street, shouting and thrusting their pikes and driving forward toward the middle of the city. Quadrim slowly lowered the stones to the ground, as far out of the way as he could. He leaned against a cold stone of the gateway and relaxed. Between one breath and the next, he was asleep. And that's all for this evening. So, we kind of hope that they go on with the taking of the city. We'll find out when I talk to you again. So, have a good night. And thanks for tuning in.